Cyberpunk 2077 is currently my biggest guilty pleasure in gaming. It's a title that has no right to be adored by critics, given the extensive list of issues within the game and the tumultuous handling of its release outside of it. Still, I feel compelled to open this massive video by sharing my fondness for the game. And yeah, that's because a lot of this video is going to be about bashing it. So, while it might be taboo to say it, yeah, I liked Cyberpunk 2077. I'd like to establish that positive perspective from the outset, considering that most of this video will be about bashing the game and holding it accountable for its flaws. And in some regards, it's appropriate to hold this game to an even higher standard than most, given the premier status that CD Projekt Red was given by critics and fans for the way the company championed a pro-consumer mindset. After years of riding the success of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, the good faith stopped with the reports of intense periods of crunch and the downright ugly release of Cyberpunk 2077. Covering up the game's abysmal launch state by requiring critics to use only provided footage was downright shameful, dishonest, and misleading. These feeble attempts to shroud the game's poor state was pretty much seen through immediately by all of us, but you've no doubt already heard about the unbelievably bad state of the game at release on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, as well as the numerous issues on PS5, Xbox Series X, and even PC, so I won't spend too long walking treaded ground. Enough has already been said about the handling of this title's launch, and so this video will be more focused on the internal failures of the latest product of the video game hype machine. It isn't all bad though, and that's a point I need to stress now. When you dig through the many layers of questionable choices and corporate marketing bullshit, you're left with dirty hands and a good but not great game. Certain elements shine through the muck and catch your eye with the glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this game will be great someday. But coming along with that hope is the dreadful realization that Cyberpunk 2077 is no Witcher 3. At times, though, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Night City and its surrounding desert lands look more beautiful than the sprawling forests and cities of Novigrad. Night City didn't really wow me immediately, but I grew a greater appreciation for it as I continued to learn its layout while completing missions. The streets are lit up with neon signs beckoning patrons to come inside, offering up both everyday items and futuristic body modifications interchangeably. The skyscrapers are truly massive, towering over V, especially in the dead center of the city, where the looming buildings can feel claustrophobic at times. Some of the best vistas in the game can be found right here in the city. After taking a short elevator ride to a rooftop, you'll be greeted with a gorgeous view of the city skyline. And that feeling of being trapped while on the city streets is totally alleviated at altitude with views like this. The desert lands around Night City also create a dichotomy of sorts, as the wide open spaces clash hard with the dense streets of the metropolis. The neon lights and gargantuan structures are replaced with long stretches of sand, and well, more sand, with the occasional gas station thrown in to boot. While it took me some time to find the beauty in the city, no such wait period was required while traversing the sandy roads. Some of the game's most consistent moments of high-quality visual appeal was found out in these more natural environments. My earlier use of the word dichotomy suggests that there's a rigidness between the city and the sand, that one immediately gives way to the other, but that isn't really the case. What truly holds this game world up beyond the flaws that we will get to in a moment is how much work was put in to ensure that moving between these two polar opposites felt natural and realistic. As you push closer and closer to the sprawling desert, the cityscape starts to loosen its grip on the skyline. Tall skyscrapers are replaced with blue-collar industrial areas, rural neighborhoods, and the homes of wealthy elites, depending on which route you take to leave the city. This attention to detail not only provides the city with some variety in its design, but also ensures smooth transitions whenever traveling back and forth between the two major game areas. Unfortunately though, Night City's design still leaves a lot to be desired, as it has a major issue with player navigation, while also lacking some design elements that would truly make this place feel more alive. The player's ability to navigate the open world in Cyberpunk is some of the worst I've encountered in 2020. Games like Ghost of Tsushima, Spider-Man Miles Morales, and Watch Dogs Legion were able to find ways to blend HUD elements into the world itself, making traversal and navigation a breeze. But that's just not the case in 2077, where you'll find yourself spending most of your time staring at a minimap. That's right, all that natural and man-made beauty I described a moment ago is reserved for moments where the player is actively seeking them out, not while traveling from mission to mission. The minimap is your sole source of directing V through Night City, and it's so zoomed in that turns will come up quick, resulting in a lot of brakes screeching and vehicles being thrown into reverse. And the sometimes floaty driving doesn't aid in this endeavor. It feels downright terrible to be playing a game that insists on the player gluing their eyes to the minimap in 2020 after it feels like a problem that so many other games have already solved. Despite this constant need to stop and change direction after missing a turn, you won't find yourself slamming into vehicles too often because Night City feels pretty barren at the ground level. The cramped streets probably make it necessary for traffic to be kept light, so that the player isn't constantly getting stuck between other vehicles, but the result is this unyielding sensation that Night City is home to all of 214 people, only about half of which have a license. This problem of lifelessness extends onto the sidewalks themselves, as it takes all of a few seconds to locate repeat character models who lumber around like their feet are made of cement. Seriously, Night City has to be pretty laid back based on the speeds that some of these people are content to move at. All it would take is some undead filters to convince me that the city has been overrun by zombies. In The Witcher 3, the big towns felt about as populated as they do here, but it made more sense in that game given our expectations for population counts in fantasy towns versus megacities. And many folks will rightfully point to the trailer footage that showed the densely packed streets of Night City and call them misleading. And again, it's rightfully so. Night City might look gorgeous at times, but in open cityscapes, it sometimes feels as barren as the adjacent desert. Interior environments are handled a lot better though, as they usually contain the right amount of NPCs comparable to their real-life counterparts. It's clear some locations have been given a little bit more polish than others. Afterlife, for example, is a bar that you'll be visiting a lot through the main story and the side stories, and so it's no surprise that it's one of the most detailed locales in the game. It's here where you'll learn about the legends of Night City and begin to indoctrinate yourself with the vocabulary of the world, with words like choom, eddies, and preem. I love this bar, but even without the extra polish, other indoor locales and outdoor markets look and feel much more alive than at any point while driving down the city streets. The approach to open world design reminds me heavily of that in Bethesda games, mostly due to the inclusion of optional messages that contextualize the world and some of the people within them. This attempt at environmental storytelling isn't nearly as well done though in Cyberpunk, as most of the information is simply found on shards that have to be read in a menu screen. Yes, these shards have a lot of information on them, but you won't ever be able to read them in the game world itself, meaning you have to be pulled out of the experience in order to extract value from them. Sometimes the game handles this better by having information available to uncover directly on computers in the world, but even then, the attempts at world building fall flat when compared to the game it's trying to emulate. And this comparison to Bethesda games, more specifically Fallout games, continues with gunplay to a degree as well. But when it comes to world building, Cyberpunk 2077 seems to desperately want to be a Bethesda Fallout game, but it fails to do so, and instead offers up a lesser take on environmental storytelling. The world of Cyberpunk 2077 isn't the studio's greatest work, and leaves plenty of room to wonder what could have been if this game had been designed solely for next-generation hardware. Still, this effort towards world building is better than that of most other games, and continues to be an asset to CD Projekt Red. After many players reported that they didn't finish the main story of The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red elected to make the central tale of Cyberpunk much shorter, and I think this was a direction that was worthwhile to go in. Don't get me wrong, The Witcher 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, but that was due more to the world building done through side content rather than the plot points that unfolded over dozens and dozens of hours. It took me nearly 100 hours to finish The Witcher 3's main story and its side content, while it only took 47 hours to reach the same completion status in Cyberpunk, and I'd estimate only about half of that was spent on the main story. The central plot of the game kicks off with your character, V, meeting and befriending a Night City merc named Jackie Wells. The player meets Jackie after choosing their own backstory and playing out a short section that we'll talk about later. Jackie and V team up and become partners, working together to complete jobs for fixers throughout the city with the help of a local netrunner named T-Bug. This game has 2 acts, the first of which will be about working alongside Jackie, T-Bug, and a shady fixer named Dexter Deshawn in order to secure a biochip from the Arasaka Corporation. The first 5 to 7 hours of the game will be about introducing the player to the world and all its components, including Ripper docks, local gigs, basic combat options, and more before things open up in the second act with a greater sense of player freedom. You're very much railroaded down the main story in Act 1, as the side content on offer here isn't very substantial or meaty. Almost all of it is either one-off missions that are completed very quickly, or those gigs that I mentioned a moment ago. This restriction in an open world game made me enjoy Act 1 far less than I did Act 2, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that the player is shuttled down the central path at the outset. The reason for this is that Act 1 concludes with V being introduced to Keanu Reeves. Johnny Silverhand, who obviously plays a massive role in this game's events and the greater world at large. Since he's critical to the overall story, I made peace with the fact that the game pushed you towards him as quickly as possible by limiting the number of interesting and engaging side missions available to nearly 0. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Most of the missions in Chapter 1 are about tutorializing the various components of the game, some of which are handled better than others. Throughout this time, you'll meet a bunch of new characters like Dexter Deshawn, Jackie Wells, Yorinobu Arasaka, Evelyn Parker, and Royce. Each of these characters have different backgrounds and serve different roles within Night City, which ends up being a nice way of familiarizing the player with key components of this world, as well as the groups that inhabit it. You have a ton of major corporations like Arasaka, who are shrouded in shady business practices and corruption that ensures that the people at the top and bottom stay in their respective spots. You also have gangs like Maelstrom, a group defined by their extreme body modifications, making them appear more machine than human. And then you have fixers like Dexter Deshawn, Wakoko Akato, and Rogue, who link clients with mercs like you and Jackie together to get dirty jobs accomplished. There's a slow drip feed of information about the inhabitants and groups of Night City throughout the game, which feels more genuine than having characters tell you everything about a gang, a corporation, or a person the second they become relevant. By the time the introduction ends, the assumption is that V and Jackie worked in Night City for months together, so it only makes sense that V would know the culture even if the player does not. CD Projekt Red leaned on the dialogue system and the writing team to make sure that enough information was conveyed to the player without downright telling them in a checklist-esque way. And it's another way that world building continues to be one of the studio's greatest strengths. With that being said, I didn't find myself wowed by most of these Act 1 missions. You're tasked with completing 2 objectives before completing the main heist for Dexter and his client. These 2 objectives include securing a spider bot that will be needed for the heist, and meeting with the client Evelyn Parker to learn more information. The Evelyn Parker mission emphasizes dialogue and a new mechanic called brain dances, where the player jacks into the memories of another person and can explore it for useful information and clues. It took me a very long time to grasp what the game wanted from me in these missions, and that's mostly due to the fact that certain information that is required to be found may only appear in very brief moments throughout a very long recording. But anyway, this Evelyn Parker mission is fine. It does what it sets out to do. Introduce the player to dialogue options and emphasize how important that will be, and also introduce this new idea, brain dances. The Spider-Bot mission, though, is much more involved, as it gives the player a few options for how to tackle it, both narratively and from a gameplay perspective. You can choose to ask Militech for help in securing it from Maelstrom, or you can just go in by yourself. This idea of recruiting outside help was something I remember the developers highlighting during the first initial gameplay reveal for the title a few years back. It led me to believe that there would be more instances where the player could ask certain companions and factions for help with missions throughout the game. But unfortunately, that's only ever really true here and in the final mission. And that was very disappointing to me, as allowing the player to familiarize themselves with the different groups in the city and ask them for help would have provided a great sense of player expression and role-playing. You bring the group with you that you identify most with. But that never really happens, and it's a shame, and this optional moment to recruit Militech ends up feeling almost misleading because of it. From a gameplay perspective, you can sneak your way through Royce's hideout or go through it guns a-blazing in order to secure the spider bot for the final heist. There's even ways to leave peacefully or to have Militech come in and clean up the tech heads for you. There's many different factors that go into how this mission plays out, but again, it feels like one of the few missions throughout the entire game where this is possible. It truly feels like The Pickup was designed to market the game with tons of flashy options and outcomes, only for the rest of the game to fall short in that regard. But with the information and Spider-Bot in hand, Jackie and V infiltrate a hotel where Yorinobu Arasaka, son of Saburo Arasaka, is staying. The father and son have had a falling out because of the child's rebellious nature, and this has all taken place on the stage of a massive corporation. As V and Jackie reach his penthouse and secure the biochip in question, everything goes to shit, as they witness Yorinobu assassinate his father, one of the most powerful men in the world. The hotel goes into lockdown, and our duo are forced to escape in dramatic fashion. The mayhem culminates with the death of Jackie Wells, and V inserting the biochip into himself for safekeeping so that the job can be complete. Returning to Dexter reveals a man who's truly panicking after realizing that everyone involved in Saburu's death will be tracked down and killed. Dexter makes the bold choice to shoot V point blank in the head in order to cover his tracks, and this brings about the end of Act 1. After feeling disappointed in the game throughout its first few hours, this mission really brought me back on board and had me invested to see what would happen next. We're then shown a vision of a man named Johnny Silverhand, and it's a name that's been mentioned before if the player was paying attention. Silverhand was a rebellious rocker boy with a serious vendetta against the major corporations of Night City. We play through the attack he launched on the Arasaka Company and how he was eventually captured. The Arasaka Company had developed the technology to take every component of a person's mind and transform it into raw data that could be stored on a biochip for later use. And this was the fate that Silverhand met, and the biochip you stole and installed in yourself happens to hold his engram. This is what allows V to live through being shot in the head, as the biochip itself reboots his nervous system, but at a cost. V awakens in a landfill to find a man named Takamura, the assistant to Saboru, has saved him and killed Dexter Deshawn. V eventually learns through his Ripper Doc Victor that the biochip cannot be physically removed from V or else he will die, but also at the same time that it will slowly overwrite his mind and replace it with that of Johnny Silverhand. V begins to have visions of Silverhand and is actually able to communicate with him much in the same way that Batman could with Joker in Arkham Knight. This kicks off the events of Act 2, as V desperately searches for a way to rid himself of the biochip and the relentless torment that Silverhand brings to his life. Narratively, Act 2 is about the relationship between V and Johnny as they come to grips with their existence and situation while pursuing 3 different paths to find answers to the biochip problem. The first of these paths is about tracking down Evelyn Parker, since she was the client trying to get the biochip to see if she knows anything else. This is the most extensive line of quest throughout the second act and sadly leads to her death. It shows just how easy Night City can chew you up and spit you out. It also leads V to a group called the Voodoo Boys, which have discovered the technology to allow humans to breach into cyberspace. This allows V to contact Alt Cunningham, a former lover of Johnny's who I believed helped in developing the biochip that would someday be used against the man she cared for. Alt digitized herself completely and is hardly recognizable to Johnny, but she agrees to help V remove the biochip if he can make it to Arasaka HQ and link her into their systems. The second major quest line sees V tracking down a man named Anders Hellman, who worked on the Mikoshi project that generated the biochip. This introduces the player to another character named Pan Am, who we will talk about a little bit later. This is the shortest of the paths to pursue, and ends with the capture of Hellman, who reveals that there really isn't anything that can be done to save V. The engram is overriding V's brain and his nervous system, and eventually, the biochip will overrun V completely and replace him with Johnny, regardless of how either of them feel about it. And the final path means working alongside Takamura, the man who saved us, and needs our help in proving that Saburo was murdered by Yorinobu. The child was able to cover his tracks and lead everyone to believe that his father was poisoned, not strangled. Takamura looks to avenge his boss and agrees to try to help V if he in turn helps him. This eventually leads to Takamura and V consulting with Yorinobu's sister, Hanako, to reveal the truth to her. And after some time, Hanako comes around to believing V's story of murder after she was almost killed herself, and this leads to the game's final string of missions. So I went through those 3 quest lines rather quickly, but I don't really want to spoil them too much or talk about every single detail of them. Throughout those 3 quest lines, you'll meet lots of interesting characters, but the most important one is the guy living inside your head. The handling of Night City legend Johnny Silverhand could have been done better. At the outset, Silverhand is obviously viewed antagonistically by V, and it remains this way for most of the second act. The two sort of get used to the other being around, but most of the ways you can interact with Johnny remain rude or antagonistic. The game goes out of the way to make sure the order in which you are to complete the three main quest lines of Act 2 is obvious to the player through their difficulty indicators. Yet, the player is still able to brute force their way through them in whatever order they would like. This means that V's perception of Johnny can't be overly sympathetic in any of these mission chains, because it would throw off the overall relationship. If Johnny and V get along at the end of the Evelyn Parker questline, but then act shitty towards each other as soon as you start the Hellman questline, then there's going to be a lot of confusion in the player's mind. I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say. Because the quest can be played in any order, you can't really have the relationship between V and Johnny change too much in one, because then it might not align with what happens in another. This results in a lot of stagnation between Johnny and V for much of Act 2, especially when you throw a lot of player choice in there. But then, right as the game begins to head towards its finale, you unlock a string of side quests that can boost your relationship with Johnny. It's here where the relationship between these two seems to flip on its head, as they can quickly become closer if the player guides them down that route. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's hard to ever get a good read on what the dynamic is between Johnny and V, and I think it's actually an example of player choice robbing the narrative of impact. With that being said, it might be better on subsequent runs when you know what the final outcomes will be. In that instance, you could better tailor your relationship to jive or argue depending on how you're role-playing V. So by the time you reach the game's final mission, you'll have a few options on your hands depending on how you've built the relationship between V and Johnny and how far you've progressed quest lines in the side content. The three major choices are allowing Johnny to take control of your body to storm Arasaka HQ, trusting the corporations by partnering with Hanako, or calling for aid from Pan Am. There's even a secret ending if you've built a good enough rapport with Johnny that leads to a solo assault on Arasaka HQ. But regardless of which ending you choose, the game's final moments are disorienting and didn't leave me with any sense of satisfaction. I opted to let Johnny take control of V and go in guns a-blazing alongside of Rogue. This results in her death, which really didn't feel good. Rogue was one of my favorite characters in the game. She's the ultimate fixer of Night City and the queen of the afterlife. I would have much rather had her fight alongside of me in the confrontation with Atom Smasher. If she died there, in actual gameplay, so be it. It would have been on me for not protecting her enough. But when she dies in the cutscene, I felt powerless as a player in a game that has always been insistent on putting the gun in my hand. Also, the game acts like the player will be heavily incentivized to kill Smasher, but there's too much of a disconnect between the player's motivations and Johnny's. Regardless of how you treat him, he will always feel like an intruder, and it's hard to get yourself into his mindset. Therefore, this fight didn't carry much weight to me, despite the implications and the background that went into it. And it got worse as I reached Mikoshi and linked in to allow Alt to separate V from Johnny. There ends up being a glitch in the system, and it's revealed that Alt can't really do what she promised in a way that will allow V to return to normal. The player is presented with a new option: either allow Johnny to take control of V's body and live prosperously, or to give V control back with the stipulation that he's gonna die in a few months' time. I felt so robbed of the choice the game had been building towards the whole time. I felt all that work had been doomed from the beginning, which just didn't feel good. And the somewhat mishandled relationship between V and Johnny made this final sequence very bizarre, where V begs Johnny to take over his body. I just felt so confused as to what was going on, and I stumbled into the ending where Johnny takes control of V's body and goes back into the world to live out his life. It ends with Johnny inspiring a young boy before leaving Night City behind. I felt the game didn't do enough to convey to the player which ending path they were going down. It all just kind of happened. In a moment where I was supposedly put in the driver's seat to make a choice for how this game should end, I felt very much like Johnny as he bummed a ride from this kid. Like I was riding shotgun. This ending did nothing for me. Nothing. I didn't feel any sort of connection to Johnny or V anymore. Events happened and then the game ended and I just wasn't fazed at all. The only real emotion I felt was confusion. What just happened? What happened to Yorinobu? Is V trapped in cyberspace? Who is this young boy that Johnny befriended? What was the entire point of the game? It's going to go down as the most forgettable ending to a game that I've ever played. The handling of the game's main narrative is sloppy and never completely gels within itself. It presents a world where corporation power has created a stranglehold on society, but it's rarely ever felt by the player. We spend the whole game being told by Silverhand that corporations are evil, yet we rarely ever see that in a way that portrays an overly negative impact on Night City. We're never really given enough information to either side with Johnny's perspective or that of major corporations. It felt unfocused, and I came away from this game feeling lost when trying to figure out its overarching theme. It's like they came up with cool characters, but failed to put them in interesting situations. I really get the sensation that the developers felt that they could rely on the star power of Keanu Reeves alone to carry the narrative, but it created a scenario where style was more important than substance. Sadly, the game creates such a memorable world that raises many fascinating topics to explore, like how does body modification influence our perspective on humanity, and what might happen if megacorporations are left unchecked. Yet, the game offers up no commentary on these topics, nor do they use them to create moral dilemmas. It really left me feeling disappointed. The main story ended up being nothing more than alright. It held my attention enough to get me through the game's main quest, but hardly ever pulled me in outside of a few missions here and there. And the finale just left me wanting more in a bad way. Like I said, I really feel like they put a lot of stock into the performance of Keanu Reeves, hoping that he would be enough to carry the main plot. And while Johnny was a deep character, it just didn't end up living up to the standards that the studio set for themselves with their previous game. Luckily for Cyberpunk 2077 and CD Projekt Red, this is a game about the journey, not the destination. Traversing Night City doesn't just mean partying it up with Johnny Silverhand. Oh no, you're given plenty of side content to explore alongside of characters from different facets of life. It's in these side missions where you meet Night City's most memorable characters, and get to explore and grow with them through some well thought out stories and quests. No game has been praised for its side content more than The Witcher 3, and while this game's side content doesn't live up to those lofty standards, it still does a lot more than most open world games. Before we get to that though, I kinda have to address the elephant in the room. V's a character living on borrowed time, as the biochip is consistently plugging along in his brain, overriding his memory and personality. Finding a way to stop this process should always be his #1 priority, yet the player is given ample time to go on adventures that won't result in his salvation. The player and V are at odds in this moment. As a player, you have to put V's predicament on hold for a while in order to engage with the side content. It's worth doing, but it does lead to a little dissonance. So we'll talk more about quest design later, but in terms of actual side missions, they can be broken up into 3 categories: one-off missions, quest lines involving alternate activities, and quest lines focused on fleshing out some of the characters that V meets. The one-off missions aren't usually too spectacular and wrap up after a few minutes. Take this one for example, where you attempt to discover a stalker prowling after a famous band member. This side quest wraps up in 10 minutes or less and ends with you finding and incapacitating the stalker without there being much more to it. They're pretty forgettable. Then there's also quest lines that involve alternate activities like fighting, chasing, and racing. These quest lines can be a tad repetitive, but they still stand high above other open world games that include side activities like these. On their own, events like racing and fighting are not revolutionary. Tons of games have this kind of side content. But CD Projekt Red enhances them by including character stories and beats within these missions. For example, in the string of fighting quests, one character you can fight is trying to win a ton of money to take care of his baby mama and soon-to-be-born child. After beating him, you can make a choice to allow him to keep the prize money. Choosing this option leads to him becoming a fan of yours. He will show up to the final fight to cheer you on. He'll also send you texts showing off the birth of his child and thanking you. It's little details like this that increase the believability of these characters. Even someone so minor still has reactions, emotions, and updates for the player to uncover depending on their treatment of him. But nowhere is this done better though than in the racing side quest, where you help Claire rediscover her passion for racing. At least that's what you think at the outset. As you complete more and more races, Claire opens up and reveals that her husband died in a racing accident and she wants you to help her get revenge against the killer in the final race. It all culminates with the player having the option to either win the final race or diverge from it to help Claire get her revenge. There's even a shady bit at the end that makes the player question Claire's actions. What ends up happening is left in the player's hands. It's a thoughtful series of events that ended up being one of the most memorable pieces of content in the game for me, and it was behind racing, a side activity that rarely interests me in any game. So kudos, very well done on that. But by far, the character quest lines were the thing I ended up enjoying most about Cyberpunk 2077. These quest lines were anywhere from 2 to 7 quests long, and contained some of the most appealing, original, and well thought out ideas that I've come across in games. It's here where the majority of my praise for Cyberpunk comes from. So a few of them are on the shorter side, but still maintain a very high level of quality. Take, for instance, this mission involving a man named Joshua Stevenson that actually starts out as a gig. That's right, you take on a job from a fixer to help a man get revenge for the death of his wife. It seems like it's going to be a simple task. You meet with the man, you go over the plan, and you begin to pursue after Stevenson, who's being escorted by the police. As you close in on the target, your ally is killed by the police, but V's thrown into a rapid and bizarre series of events where Joshua asks you to come with him and be a part of his day. The player can walk away right here if they'd like, but going with him reveals a fascinating story about a man seeking redemption and a corporation that's trying to take advantage of that. Joshua is a convicted killer who's been sentenced to death row. He's found faith during his time behind bars, but maybe takes it a bit too far, believing himself to be a prophet. The player is slowly drip-fed information about Joshua's situation, which creates a nice moment of connection between V and the player. Both are equally confused as to what's going on. Eventually, it's revealed that Joshua wants to be crucified, and has made connections to have this happen. A media organization hopes to jack into Joshua's head as he's killed and record his experience to create brain dances off of it for sickos to get off to. You're presented with two equally disturbing sides, a man who's a little off his rocker, and a corporation who's trying to take advantage of him. So who do you side with? Is it best to support Joshua, or to just go along with the media corporation and profit more from it since you're unable to save Josh given his judicial sentence? It's sure to stir up some uncomfortable feelings in the player, and it's one of the few times in the game where we're shown the evil side of corporations instead of just being told. Another one of these shorter ones involves the Peralez family, a husband running for mayor and a supportive wife to aid him. The couple contact V asking him to investigate their home after an intruder entered the house. V eventually uncovers that the family is being closely monitored, as even their own home contains a secret room full of tons of recording devices. There's a lot of intrigue in this mission that pushes the player forward to see who's behind it all. And eventually, you uncover a massive conspiracy showing that Mr. Peralez is being brainwashed in subtle ways as another party hopes to use him as a political puppet once he wins the election for mayor. His wife is even revealed to be in on the whole thing, unwillingly though, and she begs V not to tell the truth to her husband out of fear of what will happen to them. The player is actually put in a tough spot, as they must either opt to tell Jefferson about the mind-controlling scheme, or to let things be and let the family go on unharmed. I opted to tell Jefferson about what was going on, but it led him to having a severe mental breakdown, as he questioned his own sanity while vowing to get to the bottom of things. By telling him the truth, I flipped his entire world on its head, and put this man into a position where he can't trust anything, even his own thoughts. And it's one of the few times throughout the entire game where I felt my choice had a real impact. And the crazy part is, these are just some of the shorter chains of side quests. There's also much more detailed ones, 5 of which come to mind. That of Judy's, Carrie's, River's, Panam's, and Johnny's. Judy's story unfolds after the death of Evelyn Parker, as you aid her in securing I guess you'd call it a strip club? I'm not really sure. Essentially, Judy recognizes how much pain the management and their association with the Tiger Claws is causing the workers, and wants to take control away from these people. She's motivated to do this because Evelyn's death was in part due to her experience working at that club. Now, to be honest, this story didn't really pull me in as much as some of the others, and neither did the big choice at the end of it, to either eliminate the current manager or side with her to make extra money by selling out Judy. It just didn't feel like much of a choice. Side with a sleazeball, or how about a friend? What really stood out to me from this mission, though, was the final quest, where you uncover more about Judy's upbringing when you explore her hometown with her. It might not sound that interesting, but when you realize that it's completely underwater, it makes for a fascinating discovery and sequence of events. It was just a really cool mission, there's no other way to put it. Out of all the major side quest chains, Carrie's was the least interesting to me. Mr. Uridine was a former member of Johnny Silverhand's band called Samurai, and your goal is to help him come to terms with the decision he made when he signed with a major record label and sold out his bandmates. He's very bitter when you first meet him, so much so that he goes after a young group of women who've become very popular in Japan. The band of women come to Night City to spread their music, and are using one of Carrie's songs in their set. This infuriates Carrie to the point that you must help him blow up their equipment and then track them down for a direct confrontation. This quest really lost me though in this moment, when Carrie storms in like an absolute nutcase and holds these girls up at gunpoint with threats, only for them to nearly fall head over heels for him. They tell him they love his music in a totally fangirl way, as if they aren't being held hostage. This was one of the few moments in the game where I was pulled out of the world. It felt completely forced. I mean, come on now, it's just too much. From there, Carrie has a change of heart and ends up working alongside the girls and creates a new song with them before blowing up a corporate man's yacht. Out of all the side quests in the game, this is the one that I felt least involved in, as if Carrie was on his own path, and I was just kind of along for the ride. Ideally, these side quests strike a good balance between the ability to influence the NPC with dialogue and decision making, and also the NPC's believability as a person with their own agency. And this one really failed to find that balance. I can't say the same for River's questline though, as it was the one I enjoyed the most. River is your stereotypical, washed-up cop who takes the law into his own hands. You first meet him while trying to solve a case for the Perales family, but eventually you'll have to help him track down the location of his missing nephew. The quests that follow are the closest the game ever comes to horror, and what goes down is as captivating as it is sadistic. You'll first have to help narrow down Randy's whereabouts in a pretty cool detective sequence as you search his belongings for potential clues, and how much information you uncover will determine if you can save him or not. Overlooking details in the brain dance will set River and V back, and losing those crucial moments will drastically affect the outcome you get to this quest. It's a good way of making the player feel like their contributions are having a real impact on the events unfolding. Regardless of what you uncover though, you won't be mentally ready for what you're about to stumble into as you reach the farmhouse where Randy is being kept. You arrive at the scene to find a barn surrounded by turrets and landmines set to dispose of any intruders. Making your way inside, you realize that people are being kept here like livestock, with toxins being force-pumped into their systems. The man kidnapping and killing teenagers in this farmhouse grew up in an abusive household, and he's clearly gone psychotic as a result of the malice. If you found all the clues earlier, you'll arrive in enough time to save Randy, which is what happened for me. You're then left with a broken version of River, and it's up to you to steer him back on the right path as he promises to murder the killer for what he's done. The chain of quests ends with you joining River for a nice family barbecue and discussing what River did following saving Randy. Out of all the side quest lines in the game, this one will stick with me the most, as it got me invested into an interesting but horrifying sequence of events and made my actions have consequences for the characters around me, which was great. And then there's Panam, a character who has more personality than anyone else in the game. She's a nomad, meaning she lives on the outskirts of Night City and travels the desert lands with her gang, just looking to survive and thrive. Her questline is about exploring her relationship with her clan, more specifically, how her desires clash with that of the leaders. It's another questline where I didn't feel I had that much of an impact as V, but Panam's personality was able to win me over. Perhaps what endeared me more to this questline was that Panam was the character I chose to romance in the game. That's right, you can romance any of these 4 characters depending on what your build is as V. It gave me the option to make romantic moves on everyone except for Judy, given that I was playing as a male version of V. Some players might be annoyed by the fact that they can't romance everyone with a single character, but I like it. It adds to the believability of the NPCs. I couldn't romance Judy because she's attracted to women. Her believability as a character wasn't sacrificed just to give the player unlimited options, and to me, it helps in maintaining the believability of these characters. And I kind of already talked about this in the main story section, but towards the end of the game, the player will have the option to help Johnny if they've grown to enjoy his company. These quests are the ultimate trust exercise, as you're told Johnny will need to take control of V's body using a medicine that temporarily flips control. I mean, yeah, it's totally plot medicine, but still. Some of the most emotionally resonant scenes in the game come from this questline, as Johnny comes to realize that a lot of the people he was closest with were driven away by his attitude and demeanor. He's able to reconcile with some, but other relationships are left damaged despite his attempts to make amends. It's a pretty good series of quests. I just wish they weren't mandatory in order to start Carrie's questline. And so while I love most of the side stories and getting to know these characters, very few of them ever put me in a situation where I had to make a tough moral choice. And even fewer of them capitalize on it by creating tangible consequences that impacted characters and the greater world. Outside of River's questline and the Perala's questline, I mostly felt like I was a passenger on a train riding by and catching a series of events without ever being able to get involved in them. This was particularly disappointing after playing a game like The Witcher 3, which made sure that the world changed just a little bit after you and Geralt made a choice. In that title, choices didn't always play out exactly as you might predict, which made for many moments of well-crafted subversion. Sometimes the consequences were made obviously immediately, but other times the game world was updated with little hidden scenes showing the effect of your choice. The player might not always stumble onto these consequences, but it still signified actual change that the player brought to the world. And sadly, that's rarely ever the case in Cyberpunk 2077. As we begin to transition more into the gameplay of Cyberpunk, I'd like to start by saying that the character building is quietly one of the game's most well thought out and implemented systems, as it provides a lot of depth for those who are willing to put in the time to understand the perks and spec appropriately. But I can't really say the same thing for the character creator, because it's actually really bare bones. So, of course, the ability to customize your in-game genitals grabbed all the headlines, and the wow factor of that kind of took away from the truth, that the character creator isn't very good. I struggled to make my ideal version of V, and I think that was in part due to how little information the menus show you. Most character creators generate a visual of the various hairstyles so that you can get more information faster. In Cyberpunk, there's simply a set of arrows that allow you to shuffle through each option one at a time. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but this is applied to every feature that you can customize about V. This proved to be a nuisance, but on top of that, I just don't think there were enough options given to the player. I mean, I get it, most of the game is played in first person, but honestly, I'm grateful it was, or else I would have been mortified looking at this creature throughout the entire game. It's just a little too close to the uncanny valley for my taste. The whole creation process was very restrictive, and I couldn't ever come up with a version of V that I was truly happy with, so I just moved on. But yeah, you can give yourself a big dick, so I guess that's what the people really wanted. The base stat and perk systems get better as the game goes on, but at the outset, I found a lot of this information to be super confusing. First, the terms that they decided to use for some of the base stats just left me clueless. Like, for example, one stat is called cool. That's it. I thought this would be tied in heavily with the dialogue system and give you extra options in conversation. But no, it's actually tied to stealth. But even after reading further into what each stat does, new players are going to be partially lost. Take the intelligence stat for example. It increases your net running abilities. What does that mean? I'm brand new to the game. You can't expect me to understand in-universe terms as someone who's just been brought into the experience. And the same goes for the quick hack boosts that come along with it. A player won't really have any clue what that entails before getting into the game world to gain context. This wording is going to have many players befuddled before they even get into the game, and it might lead them to invest points into things that they didn't mean to simply because they couldn't comprehend what the information meant. However, once you get further into the game and you start to understand these terms more, the stats and perks really begin to gel and offer the player a lot of variety on how to construct V. You earn stat points by leveling up, and you earn perk points by using abilities or weapons within the game world. I'd say it most easily compares to a system like the one in Skyrim, where the more you use a skill, the more perk points you earn. The nice thing though is that perk points can be allocated into any specialization tree. However, certain perks can only be used when you increase a specific skill to a certain level. To give you an example, say you use handguns a lot. You're going to earn experience towards the handgun skill tree. Every level you earn will grant you a perk point that can be used in any skill tree. However, to unlock the final skills within that handgun skill tree, you'll have to continue using that weapon type to gain access to it. Having the freedom to invest a perk point anywhere while still leveling up my desired skill trees was refreshing, and it felt freeing as a player. And you can invest those stat and perk points into a multitude of different things. You can opt to specialize in a certain weapon type, whether it be blades, handguns, assault rifles, or shotguns. You can also allocate points into stealth abilities to make V much more capable of moving undetected past foes. Or you can explore the multitude of quick hack abilities that will have you reigning over this world like a hacker god. And if you're anything like me, you can stumble through the entire experience, putting points towards a very specific build, only to change your mind after stumbling on to a cool new weapon. The point is, it allows you to roleplay V in a variety of ways. However, I can't help but be saddened by the fact that dialogue options really didn't get their own skill tree. I feel this game really missed out on having the ability to talk your way out of sticky situations. To be clear, you do get dialogue options based on your stats, but they aren't specifically tied into a dialogue skill tree. For example, if you've invested enough points into the body stat, you can intimidate people in conversation, but it just doesn't feel the same. Speaking of role-playing, one of the first choices you'll make in this game is establishing a backstory for V. You can make him or her either a nomad, a street kid, or a corpo insider. I remember these were another inclusion that were hyped leading up to the game's release. The general consensus was that these life paths would start with their own unique quests before the game started proper and would last for a couple hours. That doesn't really seem to be the case at all though, and it's a shame because it could have been another way to incentivize the player to do multiple playthroughs. Instead, these life paths are just forgettable one-off missions that will be over in the span of about 30 minutes. I chose the Nomad path, and it started with V getting hassled by a cop in a dingy town. From there, I rode to a radio tower, I asked the guy for some information, and then I met Jackie, and the story began properly. I guess no matter what path you choose, V is instantly mesmerized by the lifestyle that Jackie offers to the point that he agrees to become his partner before the game flashes forward a few months for the main story to begin. Either way, you have to meet Jackie, meaning that all three of these life paths don't really mean a whole lot. After this introductory quest ends, the only influence your life path will have on the game is some extra dialogue options that may allow you to relate to characters better, which I guess is fine. It didn't do much for me, and I was genuinely unimpressed with this option. The final thing I want to talk about in this character building section is, of course, your ability to mod V using biotech and cybernetic upgrades. In a world defined by the ability to change the human body, and where nearly every NPC you come across has some sort of body modification, it's a shame that these systems seem so half-baked to the core experience of Cyberpunk. The game introduces the concept of Ripper Ducks in its opening missions, as you meet Victor and get some new upgrades modded onto you. However, at this point, a majority of your options are not going to be accessible, and the game hardly, if ever, allures you back into this menu. If I wasn't reviewing the game, I wouldn't have ever felt drawn back to the Ripper Docks to get new upgrades. This video exists, so you know I went back and checked them out. And well, I decked V out with a cybernetic upgrade in every slot. And outside of the gorilla arms that gave me a huge boost to fist damage and a leg upgrade that let me double jump, I didn't notice a single one. Even as I typed this, and now that I'm reading it, I can't recall any other upgrades or how they affected my gameplay experience. So not only does the game fail to remind you that these exist after the first few hours, but once you do get them, very few are felt in a meaningful way as you continue to play. Cybernetic upgrades should have been an integral part of the gameplay, given the world that this game takes place in. But instead, it's handled so apathetically that I genuinely believe that most players will forget that they exist or hardly ever notice the upgrades. With that being said though, definitely be sure to get that ability to double jump. You cannot believe how good it is and how many times you'll use it in this game. So as I reflect on this character building section, I kind of realized that I was really harsh on it, and rightfully so. But again, I do want to re-emphasize that there are a lot of options. Once you get into it and you understand what a lot of this information means, you can build V in a lot of different ways. And that's always a great sign in an RPG. So that's all the ways you can build your ideal version of V. But now that you've got him or her spec'd out how you'd like, what exactly is there to do in the world of Cyberpunk 2077? Well, quests, of course. There's 4 types of quests. These include main missions, side missions, gigs, and NCPD scanner missions. 2 of these, the main missions and the side missions, provide a lot of high-quality content for the player, while the latter 2 seem to be included to pan out the game's runtime. Seriously, it'll take you probably about 40 hours to do all the main missions and the side missions, but I'd estimate that it will take an additional 30 hours just to clear out all the gigs and NCPD missions. So let's take a look at some of these. The NCPD missions are filler personified, and much like Pokemon, there's about 150 of them spread throughout the game map. Almost all of these involve walking up to a group of gang members, killing them, and then finding that one piece of context-sensitive information within the nearby area to complete the job. I'm not sure if any of the mission-ending items give more information on the crimes you stopped, but I was given 0 incentive to even check. If nearly all of them are presented identically with little variation, then you can be sure asking me to read a small message in the game's menus in order to contextualize it will fall on deaf ears. All I know is kill the bad guys, get the information, go to the next one. It's rinse and repeat. This is what you'll be doing the entire time if you plan to complete all of these. It's about as artificial a way to balloon the game's potential runtime as you can imagine. The gig missions are slightly better, as you'll often be given context from a local fixer before and after completing the necessary objective. They also provide a little bit of variety. You might have to escort someone, you might have to steal and transfer a vehicle, you might have to discover the remains of someone, or you might just have to kill a bunch of bad dudes. Still, these gig missions are mostly forgettable unless you're willing to put in the time to read the messages and the shards that come along with them, which outline more information about the people involved. Doing so would flesh out the world more, but it's done in such an inorganic way that I couldn't be bothered with it. These gigs are dressed up more than the random NCPD scanner jobs, but they still don't provide much value to the player outside of maybe practicing their combat or stealth skills. Anyway, there's a line of thought that connects these gig missions with the monster hunt quests in Witcher 3. Both of these categories, the gigs and the monster hunts, were right under the main missions and the side missions for the most prevalent quest types. And it's safe to say that the monster hunts blow gigs right out of the water, and it's not particularly close. These gigs feel like a step down, and that's a shame, especially considering you built a world with so many types of factions. I would have much rather seen these gigs replaced with faction quests where you can help out or betray groups like the Animals, Maelstrom, Militech, and the Tiger Claws. what we got ends up feeling like wasted opportunity. The side missions and the main missions are structured much better though, as to be expected. The side missions, as we've seen, flesh out the world even more, while the main quests advance your attempts at removing the biochip from your head. These sorts of missions are lengthy and drawn out, but not in a bad way. You'll find an emphasis on keeping you in the game world as much as possible. This means often walking and talking with NPCs, while also chatting with them while traveling down the road in vehicles. Often combat is weaved into these quests, but it's done more so as a quick change of pace. Truly, the emphasis in main missions and side missions is about fleshing out the world and advancing the plot, and for me, that was a major plus. To the surprise of no one, dialogue continues to be one of CD Projekt Red's greatest strengths. To be quite blunt, you'll spend much more time chatting with NPCs than you will in combat, and I wouldn't have it any other way. While it never really factors into your character building, you'll learn a lot about Night City and its inhabitants based on the way people speak and what they talk about. Almost every NPC has been given a distinct personality and comes equipped with different backgrounds and motivations that influence their perception of the world. And each of them speaks in a natural way, meaning that each person feels authentic to this world. They don't talk like someone working an information kiosk, just doling out info in a bog-standard way. No, they each speak with the assumption that V understands exactly what they mean, even if the player doesn't quite follow along at first. I mentioned that I'm not a fan of that approach when it comes to character building and permanent stat and perk choices, but in this context, I love it. The game writers trust my intelligence as a player to pick up on the vernacular, slang, and vibe of the world without catering it all to me. This authenticity allows the world to feel more lived in because of this approach. The game really trusts its dialogue to keep you invested as a player, and it's a gamble that really worked out. Cyberpunk 2077 isn't a game that feels the need to constantly throw the player into combat out of fear that they will get bored sitting through dialogue. This confidence in their writing shows, as there's countless scenes throughout the game where you'll either walk or ride with a character for minutes at a time, just shooting the shit instead of shooting foes. And I love it. I'm a sucker for dialogue options that let me flesh out the world and the characters when I want to, and hearing what others had to say about this world was a real treat. And one thing that Cyberpunk actually does better than The Witcher 3 when it comes to dialogue is how it's framed. I can't even begin to tell you how many times I was talking to an NPC in this game and was stunned with the framing of the scene. It made the already rich and detailed dialogue feel more impactful and believable because of the excellent cinematography at work here. And I'm not sure if that's the right word to use or not, but truly, some of the way these scenes were shown to me reminded me of a well-done movie. Out of all the ways to approach infiltration and combat, stealth is the one I feel least comfortable talking about, since I hardly ever used it or invested points into it. Regardless of my own build though, stealth does remain an option for the player to go down if they so choose. From my limited experience with it, it was the most difficult to stick with. I played V as a man who's unafraid to pull the trigger and often went in with the sole intent of wiping out everyone in my path. Still, sometimes it made sense to go in with the stealth element to thin the herd. What I discovered though is that stealth can break down very quickly, especially if you haven't invested the proper amount of points into it and brought the necessary gear. The game does a pretty decent job of informing the player on when they are being discovered. A little meter will pop up showing the direction an enemy is perceiving you from and how close you are to being caught. It allows for ample time to re-establish a safe position without compromising on the believability of the situation too much. That balance actually really impressed me, and it's a credit to the game's level design. You can attempt to sneak past all the enemies, and this is certainly doable in some situations, but most of the times I got caught due to low stealth stats. Now, there are perks to make you harder to detect, and so I have to imagine that stealth can be a viable option if you're willing to spec properly. And honestly, you could always go for a dual approach to stealth by bringing silenced weapons or incapacitating foes by sneaking up on them. I know there's a few different ways that you can hide bodies, but I never experimented with it myself. If you're going for a stealth build though, this will be necessary, because if another enemy discovers a body, the whole place immediately goes on red alert. In my playthrough, this usually meant whipping out the guns and taking on everyone, having accepted that the time to thin the herd was over, and instead, it was time to eviscerate the herd. Playing a more violently oriented V meant I got a good taste of what this combat system had to offer, and while I didn't dislike what I experienced, I still struggle to call it anything better than average first-person shooting. It reminds me so heavily of shooting in Fallout 4, except it's slightly better so that a system like VATS isn't mandatory. But don't let that confuse you. Cyberpunk 2077 is by no means a first-person shooter, and you'll spend far more time in dialogue than you will in direct combat. And this is a good thing for CD Projekt Red, as combat continues to be one of the easiest things to criticize about their games, much like it was in The Witcher 3. Much like in their previous title, your proficiency in combat is tied to your gear stats, not your ability to aim down sights and fire off shots in a timely manner. I should clarify, I primarily played a ranged character, but it is certainly possible to build a melee fighter as well, although I can't comment on it too much. In the early stages of the game, I felt combat was super floaty, and I really struggled to aim properly. This was due primarily to the paradoxical fact that aiming down the sights on the guns severely hampered my ability to aim. Even if enemies took a few paces to their right or their left, I struggled to hit them. I quickly abandoned the idea to aim down the sights, and I got a much better feel for combat following this change. The main point I'd like to make here, though, is that combat is generally unengaging and mindless if you're able to secure high-level gear, which was the case for me. You have your assortment of pistols, shotguns, snipers, rifles, and more, alongside of some tech weapons that have interesting modifiers like smart bullets that can track enemies. Every gun obviously has a DPS stat, but a lot of them also come with modifiers that are tied to the gun with additional mod slots that the player can use to customize their weaponry. And let me tell you, some of these modifiers are crazy and borderline game-breaking for how they will cheese every combat encounter that you come up against. For example, take a look at this pistol I found about halfway through the game. It's called Crash, and it came with some pretty baseline overall stats. But a crazy thing happened once I equipped it. I realized that it had some insane headshot damage. Taking a look under the hood reveals that it comes with the following modifiers: a nearly 64% chance to land a critical hit, a 64% boost to critical hit damage, and a 3 times damage multiplier to headshots. Oh, and a 6% chance to bleed an enemy for good measure. By the time I discovered this gun, I had already invested a little bit of my perk points into handguns, which meant further boost to critical hit chances and damage. I also modded the gun by throwing a silencer onto it that increased stealth damage by 2.5 times the normal. So what I ended up with was an insanely overpowered gun that would cripple enemies instantly if I managed to connect on just one headshot to their dome. There's also a degree of aim assist, which meant I was hitting headshots without a lot of skill being necessary to do so. I was on a power trip after I got this gun, and the rest of my playthrough was trivialized after getting it. I felt invincible in combat because I could dispatch enemies so quickly and efficiently. I found myself sneaking a lot more after discovering this gun, as I could easily clear out a base with a few well-placed shots. And if I did manage to get caught, I'd storm around the premise, eliminating everyone while healing through all damage. I almost never had to seek cover. There came a point where nothing in the game felt capable of killing me, unless I stopped healing through the damage. By the end game, the only thing that managed to kill me consistently was nearby explosives that enemies happened to connect with while aiming for me. And by that point, I felt so disconnected from the combat system that anything that slowed me down just felt annoying. I had too much power, and without any challenge, this already average combat system ended up being a series of brief interruptions that separated me from the next juicy bit of storytelling and world building. The other massive issue with combat is enemy AI, particularly in gunfights. Some enemies will take cover, but most of them will just stand out in the open waiting to be killed. This was especially true once I got Crash and was capable of disposing of enemies a split second after I saw them. The worst enemies in the game, though, by far, have to be the police. I hardly ever got a wanted level in this game, but when I did, it led to instances where police would literally just spawn in. There was no effort given into spawning them into the world in a way that took thought or care. They literally just spawn onto your location and then they shoot the shit out of you until you die or you escape back to your car. You can't take them head on because killing them just raises your wanted level further while spawning in more cops the higher your level gets. It's absolutely broken. Enemies are just genuinely stupid in this game once combat begins, and it further adds to the feeling that fighting wasn't as important to the developer's vision as world building and dialogue were. To me, one of the most disappointing things about this game is your inability to talk to enemies before fighting. I know I've already said it, but I gotta say it again. If you're detected, combat starts immediately without any chance of peaceful negotiation, and I think that was a huge misstep. I'm not saying players should be able to talk their way out of every single combat encounter, but it would have been a nice way to create more ways to roleplay V. The combat system ends up being nothing spectacular or innovative, but its greatest strength is found in subsequent playthroughs because of the ability to experiment with different weapons and playstyles as you get more familiar with what's on offer. If I were ever to play through Cyberpunk 2077 again, I would for sure build V with a focus on Quickhacking. It's a set of mechanics that didn't really pull me in as I ventured through Night City, but as the game began to conclude, I started to realize the incredible potential that they have. I'm not entirely sure if Quickhacking can be enough on its own to handle enemy encounters, but it can for sure provide excellent aid in your endeavors. V has the ability to run different programs on environmental objects and enemies for various effects. Some of them are simple, like pinging enemies, turning on and off security cameras, and distracting foes. However, examining the skill tree further reveals a litany of awesome quick hacks that I wish I could have explored further, including the ability to disable an enemy's cybernetic abilities, delivering a shock damage to them, and wiping an enemy's memory so that they leave combat. These are just a few of the options I unlocked that piqued my interest, and I have to imagine there has to be many more within the game if you choose to explore quick hacks more. Although, I must admit, this little minigame that's tied to quick hacking, it sucks. It really sucks. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be comparable to Gwent, and that really is a stretch I have to imagine, but it's a minigame that appears a lot, and so is Gwent. And if that's the case, if these two were meant to be parallels, Gwent, oh my goodness, Gwent blows this out of the water. It's not even close. This little quick hacking minigame is so much more inferior. And I know, I get it, that's harsh, but I felt like this whole little quick hacking minigame right here, it was so poorly explained at the outset that it took me forever to figure out how it worked. Ugh, I hated them. Anyway, as I played the game, I found a greater appreciation for the ability to quick hack. But much like the cybernetic upgrades, it seems like the game hardly ever draws your attention to them. I mean, you use them more than the body modifications, but I think the game does a poor job of tutorializing these options and opening up players' eyes to their potential. I honestly believe that many players will finish the game thinking that they just played a first-person shooter based on how immediately and profoundly evident it is that you can wield a gun in this game. Without placing extra emphasis on quick hacking, the average player is likely to ignore these abilities, and I think that's a shame. Again, body modifications and quick hacking are two of the unique things about this world that differentiate them from other open world games, and I feel CD Projekt Red really failed to deliver. The cybernetic upgrades were basically hidden from the player, while the quick hacking abilities are hardly ever emphasized despite being a point of difference from other titles. They both feel buried in the menu system, and it sucks. Out of all the available mechanics in the game, crafting weapons and armor is the system that I engaged with the least. It feels like the studio misremembered what was so cool about crafting your own gear in The Witcher 3. In that game, it was more about the journey, as you could embark on treasure hunts that would yield blueprints to allow the player to craft new gear. That was what made crafting enjoyable in that title. But it seems the development team believed that the ability to make your own stuff was solely the reason players engaged with crafting. Crafting in Cyberpunk 2077 means looting everything in sight, breaking it down, and then using its components to craft new gear within the confines of the menu system. It's about as dull as it gets, especially considering that in order to get the most use out of it as possible, you're going to have to invest your limited perk points into the crafting skill tree. This robs you of increasing your proficiency in direct combat, stealth, or quick hacking abilities to a degree. I only ever felt the desire to craft at the beginning of the game when most of my gear was still pretty low level. But even 25% of the way through the experience, I felt no desire to craft at all. On the other hand, upgrading my existing weapons and armor was much more pleasing, as it allowed me to keep the gear that I enjoyed viable for longer. So early in my playthrough, I grabbed the perk that disassembled junk automatically just to keep my inventory cleaner, and this ended up being vital in fueling my upgrading ability. I would play the game for a few hours until I felt like my gear was getting weaker, and then I'd hop onto the upgrade screen and level up gear to meet the challenges I was facing. I didn't go too crazy with it, but like I mentioned in the combat section, I found some pretty overpowered gear, and having the option to upgrade them even further was great. This is particularly true for the armor sets, as it's quite easy to get stuck feeling like you can't dress V how you want. Very few articles of clothing seem to go together, and it led to many instances where V was dressed like an absolute goon on my menu screen simply because I was equipping the clothes with the best stats. Had I been a little bit more proactive in upgrading, I could have found a great look and kept it for the duration of my playthrough. In the end, I was hardly incentivized to engage with the crafting or the upgrade systems, and I think that's going to be true for a lot of players who aren't planning to engage with Cyberpunk for multiple playthroughs. By placing all of this into the menu screen, instead of finding ways to incorporate them into the world itself, crafting and upgrading are far lesser here than they were in The Witcher 3. It's probably not unfair to say I experienced about 2,077 bugs in Cyberpunk 2077. I reviewed the game on my PlayStation 5, and so I avoided a lot of the nasty situations and issues that the game can send a player's way. However, that doesn't mean that I didn't get my fair share of glitches and bugs. The worst of these included being unable to sprint after getting out of a vehicle, many, many, many times. Also having NPCs clip through objects, and of course, those lovely crashes. The game crashed 17 times on me in 47 hours, which is far and beyond any other game I've ever played. There's also a fair bit of ugly textures throughout the game. I mean, check this out.
Then, in the car, I doubted you would survive.
This about the biochip?
That's gotta be the ugliest video game pizza that I've ever seen. But to be honest, I've saved these complaints for the last section of the video because a lot of these technical issues can and will be fixed in patches, unlike the other core issues that the game suffers from. In terms of graphics, the game has ranges where sometimes it'll take your breath away, while others look like a title from the beginning of the PS4 era. I liked the art style, but in terms of pure output, nothing here is really going to wow you by pushing graphics to the extreme. The music in the game is pretty good too, although I couldn't find a radio station that I really enjoyed while driving around. I'm not great about talking about music, so I'll just say, I liked it overall. Voice acting, though, was very well done, with everyone sounding pretty much exactly how I thought they should based on their looks. The only real exception to this, ironically, was Keanu Reeves, who I'm willing to give a pass to based on the star power that he brought to the role. I thought the menu system was actually pretty well done for a console, as everything was reachable in just a few clicks, outside of a few exceptions. For example, the messaging system. There was just always so many names to shuffle through, with each of them having tons of conversations to look through. I mean, it was just too much. My only other complaint would be the incredibly small font used throughout the menu system that will have you straining your eyes just to check what modifiers you got on a weapon. In terms of level design, the game did pretty well in its attempt to juggle 3 distinct playstyles together. It's gotta be tough to craft intricate and well-balanced levels while knowing the player can come at them from a whole bunch of angles, including stealth, quick hacking, gunplay, and melee. With all of that to consider, I'd say the game did a pretty decent job of constructing levels to allow any playstyle to flourish for the most part. It's a tough task, and they did a good job balancing it in my opinion. My only complaint would be the recycling of enemy types. You're going to be fighting humans almost exclusively throughout the game, with just a few robots thrown in too. Despite belonging to different factions, who would in theory have different approaches to combat, all fights end up feeling exactly the same because of the extremely limited enemy variety. So, in summary, the presentation and performance is kind of a mixed bag, with some elements shining bright, while others drag down the experience into the dark. Cyberpunk 2077 was a game hyped more than any other title in recent history, and as we know, the hype train often crashes abruptly. This was the case for CD Projekt Red's latest endeavor, but there's certainly some bits to salvage from the wreckage. Their propensity for world building continues to shine as 2077 remains best in class when everything is firing on the same cylinders. A commitment to believable and well-written dialogue is the core reason for why Night City was able to feel alive as it was, despite a downgrade in population size. On top of that is of course the well-considered design of the NPCs, as well as the amazing quest that they take you on if you're willing to put in the time. While these components are not nearly as good as they were in the previous game, they continue to be the studio's greatest strengths. But their weaknesses are far more apparent in this title than they were in The Witcher 3. Basic combat in Cyberpunk is about as bare minimum as you can get, and the alternate modes of play are never given the same level of attention to make players aware that they even exist. Some of the most defining parts of the world, like cybernetic enhancements and the ability to quick hack, are overshadowed by guns, guns, and more guns. There's plenty of customization and different character builds to uncover, but only if you're willing to put in a lot of time to understand them. And if you aren't intensely hooked by this game, the chances of a second playthrough are pretty slim. That's the case I find myself in, actually. I have no problem admitting that I enjoyed Cyberpunk 2077, but it was more so despite the flaws instead of being because of remarkable storytelling or gameplay. I can't see myself coming back to this game, even when the next generation version is handed out for free. I've already played the game, and much like The Witcher 3, I have no intention of revisiting it in full, but for very different reasons. The Witcher 3 was a remarkable game from start to finish that pulled me in and never let me go. Cyberpunk 2077, on the other hand, is a game that I will look back on and say, yeah, it was pretty good, but it was no Witcher 3. Hey guys, welcome to the outro of this video. If you enjoyed it, I would heavily recommend checking out some of my other lengthy reviews from other games that came out last year, like Ghost of Tsushima, The Last of Us Part 2, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and more. And if you're really into long format content, I have a 10-hour series on the channel chronicling the beginning of the Sly Cooper franchise, including the first 3 games, so check that out too. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.